on.
Yay.
And we're live.
Welcome to the Walters Online. I'm Keondra Prier, museum educator and manager of school programs at the Walters Art Museum. And I'm filling in today for Joy Davis, who is absolutely irreplaceable.
And I'm Eleanor Hughes. I'm the Deputy Director for Art and Program, and I was the project lead on the reinstallation and reinterpretation of Hackerman House at 1 West Mount Vernon Place, which is the historic house that's part of the Walters Art Museum that we reopened almost exactly 2 years ago in 2018.
So today we were tasked with talking about the Sybby Grant letter and its relation to Juneteenth. And as the events of the last few weeks really unfolded, we thought it would be remiss to not also talk about the way the letter relates to the present in the way that we really think of the entire collection at the Walters Art Museum as both historic art, that speaks to the present and also makes us imagine a better future. So we really want to look at it today in light of the current struggle for freedom, the movement for Black lives, and all its intersections in the sense of Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw's idea of intersectionality, and the complexity of communication and negotiation.
And Keondra, in fact, Juneteenth itself marks a communication, or we might say a miscommunication, right? The date when formerly enslaved people in Texas were actually made aware of their freedom, whatever that may have meant in that moment to them, and prompts us to think about what that means now.
So normally as an educator, when discussing any object, we would begin by discussing the form and the content of the object itself. But let's do something a little radical today and start with the history of this piece entering our collection, which is layered with confrontation from our community.
That's right. So I think we have an image of the events of February 2016 when students from the Baltimore School for the Arts, which is right across Mount Vernon Place from the Walters Art Museum, who were undertaking a guerrilla history project to mark Black History Month, attached a sheet of paper to the ironwork at the front of 1 West. And you can see on the screen, on the right is Hackerman House at 1 West Mount Vernon Place. And on the left is my little iPhone photo of the laminated sheet tied to the iron railings at the front of the house. And they had been attaching these sheets to other houses in Mount Vernon, bringing attention to the identities of the enslaved individuals who lived and worked in the area. And our poster identified Sybby Grant as the enslaved cook who lived and worked at 1 West. And the students, because they're great students, cited the website that they had found this information on, and mentioned a letter that Sybby Grant had written to her master, Dr. John Hanson Thomas, who was the original owner of 1 West and who, at the moment the letter was written during the Civil War, was actually in prison. So through some online sleuthing, I was able to locate the letter, which had been purchased by a bookseller in Philadelphia. And after some fairly intensive conversations about, on the one hand, whether letters are appropriate for our collection, which they are, we have letters in the collection, and also how we might be able to enter into telling the kinds of stories that, frankly, the Walters has not been traditionally in the practice of telling, but that would be prompted by the acquisition of this letter. After those conversations, the museum was able to purchase it.
What I find so interesting about this story of how it entered our collection is the way that it speaks so well to the history of Black activism in the United States. So the students and in this guerrilla project take a direct yet indirect approach to confronting the museum and its history and legacy of owning this home. However, it's a really public, whether you think of it as an indirect or direct approach, it's a definitely extremely public, right? But Sybby Grant is also making a confrontation, right? But it's a very private way that she's having this communication.
Right. It's an incredibly complex letter. And to understand that complexity, we should probably first read the letter itself, and talk about its content, but also the context in which she sent it and some of the questions that it raised for us when we acquired it. So I'm going to read out the text of the letter, which you can see on the screen.
Mm-hmm.
It's dated, it's Baltimore, December 6th, 1861. And she
Mm.
writes, "My friend, I take this opportunity to write you a few lines to inquire after your health. I hope you are in good health. I miss you very much indeed. I
Mm.
hope the time will soon come when you will be restored to your family again, for I will ever hold you as a friend of mine. Whenever I cook a good dinner, I wish you were here to enjoy it. Yesterday, we had a fine pair of canvasback ducks made a present to Miss Anna. They were splendid, and I wish you were here to enjoy them. Those terrapins I bought, I done them in style, for you know that no one can do them like I can. I never get on my knees, but I ask God to remember you. That God that delivered the children of Israel will deliver you if you put your trust in him. Good night. May God bless you. Miss Anna is well and her ma is better. Miss Nanny and Miss Mary came down tonight to let me see them after they were dressed to go to the party. They looked very sweet. Miss Anna wearing curls. You ought to behold her face now. No more at present. I remain your humble servant, Sybby Grant." So again,
Mm.
this is the letter that Sybby Grant is writing to Dr. John Hanson Thomas when he is imprisoned, during the Civil War. And I think first and foremost, we need to acknowledge that from the very beginning of the letter, the wording beginning with "my friend" potentially challenges the expectations of the reader.
And we will definitely get into that more in a moment. But I think we need to take a step back and really fully understand the complexity of the moment that she is writing and sending that letter. So can you tell us a little bit
Right.
more about that?
Sure. So we knew from the Baltimore School of the Arts students that he was imprisoned, and a little bit more research told us that it was sent when he was imprisoned at Fort Warren, which is in Boston Harbor, and that Dr. Thomas had been rounded up along with the mayor of Baltimore and the chief of police of Baltimore, and imprisoned, because they had signed, as members of the Maryland legislature, they had signed documents advocating for Maryland to secede from the Union. So this is a really perilous moment in which she is writing this letter for enslaved people in Baltimore. The outcome of the Civil War is by no means guaranteed, and it's a difficult situation, which I think has everything to do with what she seems to be telling him in this letter.
And what's really strange is you're saying that when you purchased the letter, there was a copy in different on a different sheet of paper in different penmanship. Um,
Yes.
so can you tell why did that happen and how did
Yeah,
that come about?
really puzzled by that when we first acquired the letter. And we undertook research at the Maryland Historical Society, also just around the corner from the museum. And there was a group of letters there that were the correspondence between Dr. Thomas and Mrs. Thomas, that actually gave us the context for why Sybby Grant wrote the letter in the first place and why there was a copy of the letter. So what we found was that on December the 1st, 1861, Dr. Thomas had written to his wife from Fort Warren, and he tells her, "I have been several days on our mess committee, superintending the cooking, waiting on tables, and such other interesting occupations. I think I shall be able to instruct Sybby, tell her I hope she is well, in in making omelets."
Ah,
Right?
yeah.
So Sybby Grant's letter is dated December 6th. On December 7th, Mrs. Thomas writes to Dr. Thomas, "My dear Dr. Thomas," which is what she calls him when she writes to him, "My dear Dr. Thomas, I enclose a letter which I know will gratify you. It is a letter from our cook. She wrote it without my knowledge and brought it to me sealed, but I opened it for fear there might be something objectionable to the officers."
Objectionable to officers.
Objectionable to the officers. "No abolitionist can be made to believe that a woman who has been your slave for 22 years could have the feelings of kindness toward all of us, which her simple letter indicates.
Mm.
I wish they could see our household, how happy and affectionate they are to us. I'd very much like to have the letter published in one of our Baltimore papers, keeping back names. I have made a copy."
Ha. So a lot going on there, talking about, yes, this interpretation and really how you can read it in so many different ways. And we'll definitely get into that in a second. But there is something going on here with the papers being separated, right? With the Maryland Historical Society having part of the Thomas's collection, and this letter being separated out. And that was because, and as you told me before, that the Thomas family papers were up for auction in 2011.
Yes, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
And the auctioneer, recognizing the relative rarity of the letter that Sybby Grant had written, separated it out as a different lot, and so it was sold separately.
Incredible. So this woman who in her lived experience would have been thought of as a mere object, an extension of the household, in 2011, or zoom forward in 2011, and her writing and her letter, it has its own separate value. Just the writing alone has its own value. It's an incredible story, and has layers, so many layers with this letter. But going right back to the interpretation piece, and also note, please leave questions and comments in on Facebook. Go ahead and leave them now, and we'll get to them soon. But going back to the interpretation piece, is that what I find so incredible about your research on this letter is the numerous voices that you included in this interpretation on Miss Grant's writing. And I would like to hear a little bit more about those interpretations, especially where there's overlap or disagreements.
Yeah, I'm not so sure I would call it disagreement. Maybe what we could call it for right now is dissonance, in terms of the layers that people acknowledge her to be operating on as she's writing this letter. Because if you take it at face value, which is, taken at its most egregious face value when Mrs. Thomas says to Dr. Thomas, you see, she adores us. She seems to be saying one thing, right? She addresses him as my friend, but we have worked with different interpreters who have found different levels of meaning in what she's saying and how she's saying it. And I really encourage anybody watching this to hear some of those interpretations, which are included on the One West Mount Vernon app, which is free. It's downloadable in the App Store, and on there you can hear the voices of some of the people who've thought really hard about this letter and what it means. So, for example, some have seen her use of religious language as a really just authentic expression of faith. But other people, and again, you can hear this if you listen to the audio in the app, others see her using the language that she uses as the only way that she has for saying to Dr. Thomas, look, you right now are in an equivalent position to me. You are in prison. You're in captivity. Here I am in bondage. And this would be a really great moment for you to give me my freedom.
Absolutely. Yeah. I definitely see that, right? Like she specifically says, what I just, it's incredible. Every time you read this letter, I pick out different pieces that I'm just attracted to and hear. And of course, her saying my friend, which is something that you picked out as being like a place where you're like, really, my friend? And then when she says, I miss you, you're like, what's going on? But there are some little lines, and it really speaks to her as a wordsmith and her ability to kind of navigate this really nuanced space that she inhabits as an enslaved person, but a literate and powerful enslaved person in so many different ways. But I would like to ask you, how do you feel like your research impacted your approach to the presentation in One West? And I should go ahead and show the audience what it looks like. But how do you feel like your approach and your approach to the house itself really impacted the choices that you made about interpreting this letter, and the use of the One West app to really house the majority of the interpretation of the letter?
Sure. And I would just say my research was minuscule compared to the research that other people did, and I want to give a shout out to Dr. Jo Goman, who really did a lot of the legwork on this. She did an amazing job. So yes, finding the letter and learning about Sybby Grant, on whom I also want to acknowledge there is a lot more research to be done, as on the other enslaved people who lived and worked in the house.
Absolutely.
Finding that letter absolutely and fundamentally changed our sense of the stories that we could tell through the house and its relevance to Baltimore in the present day, not just as a magnificent building, which it is, but also as a microcosm of Baltimore history. And the way into doing that was to focus on the people in the house as well as the house itself, and not just the white families who owned the house and lived in the house and the people who designed the house and the people who visited the house, but also the people who worked there, which of course included enslaved people, free Black people, and later on in the house's history, immigrants from Europe, all of which is reflective of the much bigger history of Baltimore in the United States through the period of time that the house has been in existence. You also asked about interpretation and the decision to have the app sort of bear the brunt of the interpretation. And that's a really interesting
Uh-oh. I think we're
about
losing
the house. Did you lose me? There we go.
a little bit.
I had a call come in. Early on in our work on the house, we assembled an advisory committee that included historians, art historians, architectural historians from a number of Baltimore institutions, including the University of Baltimore, Morgan State, UMBC, and also MICA, the Maryland Institute College of Art. And the consensus among the members of that advisory committee, who we showed the letter and we talked through all the different ways that we could approach it, the real consensus was that, at least in the first instance, the best way to present the letter was not to tell visitors what it meant, not to be the museum telling people how to understand the letter, but instead providing information about the context in which Sybby Grant wrote it, and allowing visitors to draw their own conclusions. And at the same time, we invited multiple perspectives from voices outside the museum, including artists like Roberto Lugo, whose work you see here in the foreground. So in the picture you're seeing now on the screen, the letter is displayed in the case. There's a transcription of it on the wall with her signature blown up. And then in the foreground, you see works by Roberto Lugo, who responded to the letter and to her story. We also had artists including Herb Massey, Wombworks, Crystal Mack, and Antonia McAfee, whose work you also see there hanging in the dining room at One West. And we also asked members of the advisory committee, who are some of the voices that you hear on the app. And then, of course, we also had many, many conversations with visitors as we, over the 2 years in which we've had the house open.
And of course, you also did evaluations with the public, with our community, in partnership with the education team. And I will reiterate, please leave your questions or comments, or maybe alternative interpretations of the letter that you might be having in the comment section. We're happy to respond. This is a conversation, so I want to re-invite the public to engage with us during this conversation.
So of course, right now, so to come back to your question about and having over the last 2 years gotten all these perspectives and all these different understandings of what the letter means. Of course, right now we are in the COVID-19 pandemic and the museum is closed. But when we are able to reopen the house, I think there's certainly the opportunity to rethink how we present the letter, drawing on all of those insights and interpretations. And I think what's under your question, Keondra, is also the fact that the app may not be the most accessible way of making these stories accessible to the public. And so I definitely think that when we reopen, there's certainly an opportunity to continue to use the house in the way that we intended to, which is as a laboratory, right?
Yeah.
To experiment with how to make our collections and the interpretation to experiment with the way that we do that. And therefore, I think that certainly the Sybby Grant letter is one place where I'd really like to look at diversifying and making more accessible the way that we talk about the letter.
Absolutely.
I would like to ask your opinion, though, as an individual, but also as our manager of school programs, who is really has the incredibly complicated job of leading our teams of educators in teaching this letter to our K through 12 students. So, Keondra, what do you make of this? How do you approach this letter, and how do you think about the interpretation of it?
It's really layered. So on a personal level, I love it because I'm the nerd that loves digging in archives. I love spending hours in archives and really familiarizing myself with the context of things like this. Like when you come up across a letter like this, like the auctioneer realized really early, is that it's a piece of gold, right? To really understand the complexities of a Black woman's experience in that time period, it's a rare document to really come across a Black woman that is enslaved and is so highly literate and is able to navigate her space so well in so many different ways. And this is just like one slice of her life, right? She is so much more of a complex person, and we're really just getting one sheet, but all the complexity she brings to the table is really incredible at that moment. So that's me as Keondra, as someone that just loves research. Me as the school, the manager of school programs, it was a challenge. It's a big challenge to have most of the interpretation on the app. As you know, students, when they're coming into the museum, they're not really allowed to have their cell phones out, although we really push up against that because students really do learn using their cell phones. I think there's this idea often that if a student has a cell phone in their hands, that they're just like playing around or goofing off, but there are many ways that you can use a cell phone to learn. So in that way, an app actually makes sense because students often have their cell phones in their pocket and they're used to using it in the classroom. And again, you can download that One West app online. But there is also this complexity of understanding how to do archival research from the PK to 12 level. And obviously that's not something that we're fully equipping students to do. And so we're really heavily relying on our educators to equip them with the context of interpreting that letter. And I'm afraid we really did fall short in doing that. So I've heard some really problematic interpretations that were really gut-wrenching and painful for me as an educator. And so I'm really glad to hear about the ways that we're rethinking of that interpretation. But I also want to say that that is also something that as educators, we have to really think about what kind of context and the way that we're building that context for students and how much information we have to give and how much we have to allow them to interpret. And I always say that when I'm teaching teachers how to teach in the galleries is like, say what you need them to know, ask what you're actually asking, right? So give them the context they need and then ask them to reflect on portions that you actually need reflection on. And so I think that's the beauty of the multiple interpretations we have on the app is that it gives that context. And then you still come away with a billion questions like we all have.
Right.
So, a topic though that is looming right now, and bringing it back to the present as we love to do when we're talking about our collection, because we're not exploring the past for the past's sake, right? At the Walters, we're really interested in talking about how that impacts our present and the imaginings of our future. But something that I've noticed, a topic that I've seen come up, and it came up for me reading this letter and thinking about Sybby Grant, is this idea that white folks really love Black culture, but they don't love Black people. And I read that in her letter. And so I want to, so whether it's music or dance, or in this case, food, how do you see that duality come out in Sybby Grant's letter? And do you see that in her communication with Dr. Thomas?
Oh, I absolutely do. That's such a great question, Keondra. And I think that the way that she uses food and her expertise in preparing it. So she tells him, those canvasback ducks, no one makes them like I do, or the terrapins, and I wish you were here to taste it. She's using food to remind him of her worth in a way that using who she is to remind him maybe wouldn't make her case. So she's really using food to support the case that she's making with regard to her own freedoms. And I find that particularly interesting given that the opening that he gives her for writing this is to draw the connection between his situation and her situation by writing about food, right? By telling her, tell Sybby I will have something to tell her about making omelets, which I assume she already knows. Right.
And even hearing that makes me wonder, do they have this humorous banter back and forth? They seem to have this really personal relationship, or is he serious about saying that He wants to teach.
Right. Well, I think a clue to that, and I love what you said about, she's a really complex person. We know so little about her, and yet what we know about her is so powerfully evocative of who she was. So the kind of the coda to this sequence of letters that we've just traced out is that in a later letter from Mrs. Thomas to Dr. Thomas, written under the flap of the envelope, which is at the Maryland Historical Society, there's this little note that says, "Sybby says you have had long enough to answer her letter."
Wow.
Yeah.
So Miss Thomas is like this in between. She's constantly this in between in their relationship. She intercepts the letter, reads it, says it's okay, sends it forward. In fact, wants to go public with this letter. So like, it's almost a whole different conversation. Right now, we're really talking about this interaction between Dr. Thomas and Sybby Grant. There could be a whole different conversation with the relationship between Miss Thomas and Sybby.
Keondra, I think we have a lot of conversations about this. And so I think what I would propose is that we bring this full circle and go back to where we started, which was thinking about freedom, right? And come back to the title of this talk, because we haven't really talked about that. Is that good? Should we do that?
Yes, sounds good.
So there's a lot going on in the letter, and I actually personally think that all of these interpretations are sort of valid simultaneously. But so Keondra, when you and I first had our conversation about this several weeks ago, do you want to talk about that conversation a little bit?
Yeah, it was hilarious actually, because we both went in being like, who's going to say it? Like, how are we approaching this topic right now, in this moment, right now? Is this really what we want to do? Is that appropriate for this moment? And something in our back and forth, we realized we were absolutely on the same page on how to talk about this letter and its relevance in this moment. But another thing that was really serendipitous is the song that we both had playing in our heads when we were talking to each other about. So do you want to give the little Nina Simone reveal and why we titled it this way?
So as the title of the talk would indicate, the song that we both found out that we both had in our heads as we were talking about it was Nina Simone singing I wish I knew how it would feel to be free. And more specifically, there's a video on YouTube, which I encourage everybody watching this to go and see, that is Nina Simone performing that song at the Montreux Jazz Festival in 1976. And always in my head, as I've been thinking about this letter, is that performance by Nina Simone really resonates with the complexity that I see in Sybby Grant's letter. For those viewers who aren't familiar with Nina Simone, she was a pianist, she was a songwriter, a singer, and an activist, someone whose very public struggles with the legacy of the history that Sybby Grant's letter comes out of. Her struggles were expressed through the absolute genius of her music, but also had a terrible impact on her mental health. And that performance, and to your point, Keondra, about
culture, yeah,
in front of a white audience at the Montreux Jazz Festival, that performance of Nina Simone's really encompasses such an incredible array of emotions. There's rage, there's humor, there's self-deprecation, there's defiance. I mean, the way she finishes the performance is unbelievable. And these moments have very public kind of self-reflection. And she changes the lyrics of the song in that performance from I wish I knew how it would feel to be free to I already know how it would feel to be free. So she's not asking for freedom. And to use Sybby Grant's point of reference about the God that released the Israelites, she's not asking for freedom. Let my people go is not a request. So I really, what was incredible to me about the fact we both had that song in our heads was that Nina Simone's performance, which according to her daughter, her performances were inextricable from her life off stage, the way that she lived her life, that it has the same complexity as the things that Sybby Grant is expressing in her letter. And it reminds us that all these things can be true at once.
Yes, it's incredible. I mean, these two Black women are just so incredible in so many ways. So we have Nina Simone, who is this classically trained pianist. So in spite of all the things that are said, she's being told no. Like she invited to these music schools in Philadelphia, and then they find out she's a Black girl, and they say, no, you can't come. And she's just constantly struggling through her career to just be free, just to be herself, an excellent musician. And so her activism really is just to say, I know I'm a human. Like you say, it's not a request to be free. She finds her freedom, as she says, on the stage, right? That's where she finds her full self, is in that performance. In performances, she feels like she can be her full entire self. And I think the reason why Sybby Grant, when talking about and thinking about Sybby Grant, you hear Nina Simone in your head, because in her writing, in this one letter that we have from her, we have this sense that in her cooking, in her being, she knows who she is. She knows she has value way beyond the walls of the Hackerman House, right? Of way beyond the walls of how her identity is infringed upon as an enslaved person. She knows that it's from God, right? And she's claiming this in the letter, right? She's like, no, there's a lineage here of how the Bible speaks about my spiritual wealth and my spiritual being and where I belong. And she just really beautifully enforces that in her writing. And it's an incredible peek, a sliver into who she is, really. So
beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellie. But I want to make sure. Oh, okay. So I want to. This isn't a question, but I want to draw. Carolyn Cochran had a message for us, and she said that she heard her singing that in 1967 at the Apollo, and it was transporting. And and obviously she's talking about Nina Simone. Incredible. I wish I could have been there.
Absolutely.
And then Allison Gulick has a question. She asks, do we know what happened to Sybby Grant after emancipation?
Thank you. That is a great question. We don't know. We don't know at what point she separated from the household, whether she was given her freedom before emancipation, or whether it happened at the end. But we think we have a lead on where she was. There's a couple of little breadcrumbs that, again, require more research. But we have located an S. Grant who was cooking at a given intersection in Baltimore, according to a city directory, several years after the Civil War ended. Now, that intersection happens to have been the location for the Union Club, which is, almost, so requires more research for confirmation, but that would be super interesting. There's also much later in the 1890s, when she would have been quite elderly, there's an S. Grant cooking in Washington, D.C. as well. So we don't know the details yet, but again, more research to come.
Yeah, and she's absolutely a skilled cook. So it's not a stretch of the imagination that she would be employed elsewhere after that moment, right? Like, when she's listing all the food that she's preparing for this household, and this is not, an average household, right? The Thomas household, she's preparing food for probably dignitaries, people traveling in from, so she's really putting on really amazing feasts. So it's incredible to think about what her life would have been beyond. We have another question from someone named Julia Marciari Alexander. I don't know. Do you know her?
I think I might know who she is.
You might know who she is.
Give them the Walters. We should. This is the excellent point at which to mention that Julia Marciari Alexander is the director of the Walters Art Museum, and she's given the staff the day off tomorrow to celebrate Juneteenth. So, Julia. She says, could you please talk about some of the public programs you mentioned and the approach they took to the letter, the BSA performance, Wombworks, Crystal Mech, Antonio? Oh gosh, are we going to keep doing this for another 4 hours? They were amazing. They were amazing performances. There were the Baltimore School for the Arts did work, the students working for the same teacher, with the same teacher who had brought together the original guerrilla history group, put on a performance of short plays that they had written, having done the research, having looked at the same materials that we looked at for the interpretation of the letter. And they made costumes and they reenacted these plays in Hackerman House, and it was amazing. Keondra, do you want to talk a little bit about Wombworks and Crystal Mech and sort of what they were doing in terms of the spaces of the house and sort of ritual?
So WombWorks was just so impactful that I wasn't even here and I've heard about it. I wasn't actually at the museum, but I've read about it, so I can tell you about that. But Ellie, if you want to interject at any point where I'm off, but WombWorks did these amazing performances where they were inhabiting the space as enslaved people in the house, in the home, and so they were really channeling the spirits of folks that were there. So that was what WombWorks really did. And so that what I've heard from that performance, that it was so moving that folks that didn't know what was going on were emotionally, had a serious emotional response to that. I wish there was a video recording of that so I could see it, but it wasn't, I think it wasn't, it specifically was not recorded because of the space that they were inhabiting. So that's what I heard. This is
space that they were inhabiting.
Right. This is the secondhand information based off of no video. That's how impactful that performance was. So, yeah.
And then the Antonio McAfee piece that you can see there is an installation that it really draws on photography and thinking about identity and portraiture, and I think is really powerful in dialogue with the other art that's on display in there, which is really about the fact that we don't know what Sybby Grant looked like. We don't have an image of her, and so particularly in terms of the monuments that are visible outside the window, Lafayette and George Washington, which are right outside those windows that you can see, you know, really thinks about identity and lineage and portraiture in a way that works really well, I think, worked really well with the other objects in the room.
And Allison, my fabulous co-educator, has reminded us that it wasn't just Antonio McAfee, but it was also Jay Gould who brought in photography, and he took photographs of our staff to really think about labor, not only, again, not just talking about the past and not just thinking about our collection as historical, but also talking about labor in this moment. And then we forgot to talk about Crystal Mack, who is actually a neighbor of mine here in Reservoir Hill. And I got the amazing opportunity to eat her amazing food. She's an incredible culinary artist. And so a lot of her work was really thinking about her lineage, like connection to Sybby Grant as a culinary artist. And so unfortunately, she wasn't able to cook for us, which is really just a loss for everyone else. I'm gonna say, like, I got to eat from her, so I feel super, super lucky. But she is really about like elevating the culture and the work of cooking, of preparing food, what that means for spiritual healing, for body healing, really being thoughtful about the history of foods and the things that we consume. And so she also was able to prepare an altar in that room to Sybby, which I thought was incredible. We've been so, so blessed with the artists that we've been able to work with in interpreting and thinking about this letter. So
I agree.
So we have a comment from Elizabeth Danger Norman. That's Elizabeth Norman. I know you, Elizabeth. And she just said, we have to think about representation and self-representation. Absolutely. So I think especially where the photographers were coming in, Ellie, they were really thinking about that. And absolutely, like Antonio McAfee, he's really doing some work with that, with W.E.B. Du Bois' work, where he really, really understood the power of the photograph. And in that in the Paris exhibition, where he brought in photographs of Black people, upper class, middle class, Black people in America, to showcase at the Paris exhibition, to show that, and really we're playing with this. And we talked about this in our conversation, Ellie, but we can't go into it right now, but about this respectability politics, right? Of like, we are not this like degenerate people. We have a culture, we have a history, we are artists, we're musicians, we're writers, we're all these things. And so he put a full, W.E.B. Du Bois put a full exhibition on of those. And so Antonio McAfee was playing with that. And you can kind of see that in the photo, if it's still up. The little slivers of images are representations of that work, reimagined for the space, which is really beautiful. So have you all had enough? We've been going on, right? And we could keep going. But I think we have to stop, because seriously, we were talking before and we were like, we can make this into a series if you really
we'll
want.
have a podcast.
We really could.
Keondra, it's delightful having these conversations with you. I really appreciate it.
It was all my pleasure, Ellie. And I hope you all, as in the you that's out there in the universe that we can't see, can join us again next time, probably with Joy Davis, right? Yeah. Bye.